Well, thank you. Let me get this set up here. We really appreciate the invitation to give our presentation, and we'll take you on our 27-year journey photographing wildflowers throughout the West and the eventual creation of Beauty and the Beast, California Wildflowers and Climate Change. And we'll ask that people put questions in the chat or hold them to the end, because we'll anticipate a lot of the questions that people are going to have. And we want to let everyone know that this was a very cooperative project. We could not have done it on our own. We worked, co-published our book, 12-time award-winning coffee table book, with the California Native Plant Society, and also created a traveling exhibit, which Exhibit Envoy, a nonprofit, has now been traveling around the state. And we couldn't know where all the flowers were without the members of the California Native Plant Society. So as you're members of Audubon, I'm sure you share a lot of information as to where to go and where to find the birds that you want to see. And we also wanted to have a diversity of voices for our project, and worked with a lot of different groups and individuals. If you can't get through the whole talk and you have to leave early, you can learn more at wildflowerbooks.com, and that's also where you can purchase the book. And I also put it into the chat for people.
So this all started in 1992. I was at a film lab in San Francisco processing a recent photography trip I had done, and I came across an old friend of mine, Liz Hymans, who is also a good nature photographer. And she said, you know, this year we're the Antelope Valley, California Poppy Reserve, which you probably know is an hour drive just kind of north and east of Los Angeles, is having a really exceptional year after 6 pretty bad drought years. She said, you're a California landscape photographer. I'm sure you've been to the Poppy Reserve a bunch of times and seen the flowers. I said, kind of sheepishly, I said, well, actually, I've never really been there. She said, really? You're a landscape photographer in California? You haven't been there? We really have to go. So a couple days later, she and a friend of ours and I drove down from San Francisco to the Poppy Reserve, which was about a 6-hour drive south, and this is what we found. There were just amazing different colored flowers from as far as we could see off into the distance. And what made this an exceptional year was that this year, in amongst the really bright orange California poppies, there were these beautiful purple-tipped bird's eye gilia, which made this an exceptional year, because normally in a good year at the Poppy Reserve is just covered with poppies, so you don't get this wonderful diversity of colorful flowers. So that evening I called Nita back in San Francisco. She was on an assignment at the time and couldn't come down. And I said, you really have to see what I've just seen. This afternoon I stood in front of this field of flowers and watched these waves of wind go across these glowing California poppies. It was just mesmerizing, something I had never seen before. So I drove the next day. I drove back home to San Francisco.
6 hours.
Yeah,
Just to get
6
me.
hours back to get her, because I knew that the weather conditions could change. This was probably the peak of the bloom, and if drying winds and heat come, it can dry out the flowers, and it wouldn't last long. So I drove home, got Nita, and then we photographed in the Poppy Reserve and outside the Poppy Reserve on different public lands, Bureau of Land Management land. And this was our first introduction to super blooms and the colorful carpets of flowers that happen in a really, really good rain year.
And as you know, we don't see this in the East Coast, so this was really special for us. Those are Joshua trees, in the distance and rabbit brush, an old dead rabbit brush in the foreground. So 36 years ago, I met Rob in a photo lab. I was waiting for my prints, and this print showed up.
Thank you.
And I was a people photographer at the time, and working on documenting different communities. And Rob was focused on nature photography. And 2 decades later, we decided to, after that experience, to focus on wildflowers together.
So one of the most frequent questions we get asked is, well, how far back do these floral landscapes actually go? Well, this was taken in 1984, a couple of years before I met Nita. I had been looking for a really nice example of a California buckeye tree, which you see here, and I came across these pretty purple flowers. I had no idea what they were then, but then I learned later on there's this sky lupin that occurred near the California, on the California coastal range, not too far from Carmel, if you may know where that is, which is probably about an 1.5-hour drive south from us. As Nita mentioned, I had been I'd been a nature photographer for quite a while, and after creating a good portfolio of work, I was wondering if there was something else I could do with the work besides just looking to have images printed in calendars or note cards or magazines or selling prints. So Nita suggested, well, why don't you call the Trust for Public Land, which is based in San Francisco, and see if they need any photography done. So I did, and over about a 10-year span, I was fortunate to do about 30 different projects for the Trust for Public Land. The way the Trust for Public Land operates is they identify ecologically valuable parcels of land that are held privately, and they find a way to buy the land and hold the land until a government agency, whether it's a local government agency or a national agency like the National Park Service, can buy it. So this was privately held ranch land in the Sierra Nevada foothills adjacent to Sequoia National Park. The park had identified this as land that they wanted to acquire, and I spent some time photographing there, and the land was eventually conveyed into Sequoia National Park.
And the pink flower is called redbud and is native to California. It's really interesting because it blooms before the leaves come out, and it's quite striking.
So as Nita mentioned, I had also been doing environmental work, and I'd done a project on mining on public land and saw just a lot of devastation, and also did other environmental issues such as water issues and logging, and it was just getting so depressing going to all these different places and seeing so much destruction and so much pollution. So I just, after 10 years of environmental work, I just decided I was going to focus more on conservation photography and see what I could do with my work to help preserve more land and more species.
So as I mentioned, I was a people photographer, but before that, I worked for the California Department of Forestry as a firefighter, as a seasonal firefighter. And I was the first female firefighter at Leggett Station, which is in Northern California along the Eel River. And I always kept a camera on my belt, and I came up from the Eel River where we had laid some hose and pumps and came up to see this helicopter doing a water drop on a pile of big tires that we use for land moving equipment. And that's why the smoke was so black. And I was fortunate to enter this into the Nikon International competition when I first started out my career, and won an award early on. So that was exciting. And on the right was a series that I did on the children of the Tenderloin, which is a part of San Francisco that was known for its peep shows and drugs. And that launched my career photographing children and families. On the left is an image that I photographed a powwow in San Francisco State and was hand colored by a wonderful artist, Taya Schrack, and was used among many other images that I did by the Children's Defense Fund for their calendars. They're out of Washington, D.C. And on the right is a series that I created, was called The Faces Of, and it was different communities where we were celebrating the diversity in those communities. And I did 5 different projects, and these were 7-foot banners that hung throughout the community. And I would try to get out to photograph with Rob when I could between assignments, but at some point I had a health problem that kept me from doing my regular photography, and I decided to devote more and more time to go out and work with Rob, eventually giving up the people photography.
This image was taken 2006, and Nita and I had backpacked in to this area south of Lake Tahoe. We had learned that this was an area where different bioregions had converged, and what that meant for us as wildflower photographers was that there would be a lot of different flower species in a smaller area. So we decided to backpack in, carry not only our camping gear, but 65 pounds of photo gear and lighting gear. All the flower portraits we do are done with natural light out in the field. So we would have more time if we had longer days in there, instead of hiking back and forth every day just to do day trips.
And this was one of our early experiences with climate change. There had been so much snow that year. In California, you've probably heard that we go through droughts, long droughts, and then we have huge amounts of rain and snow. And in this year, there was so much snow that the flowers were actually 3 to 4 weeks late. And we were out after Labor Day. Usually the flowers are in the mountains in July and August, and we were out in September still photographing.
This area is about 9,000 feet. And so what was really nice was that it gave us access to a lot of alpine and subalpine species.
And it's an area called Carson Pass.
So Nita was carrying 65 pounds of gear, and I was carrying 85 pounds of gear. Normally, when we did our day trips, I'd be carrying about 65 pounds of gear, and Nita about 25. And we'll tell you later on why we carried so much when we talk about how we get our photographs in the behind the scenes section of this talk.
And one of the things I didn't mention earlier is that we approached Audubon chapters because we know how important the wildflowers are for the bird populations. And we also know that climate change is disrupting, as we'll show a little later, the timing and how birds are supported by the flowers and the seeds. And in order to be able to pay for this work, we were fortunate to connect with art consultants and architects who used our work. And in this case, this was a Kaiser Medical Center that built 34 of our images into their architecture. And these panels were one of 7 panels, and it was 8 feet tall by 20 feet wide.
Whenever we could, we suggested that our art consultant use pictures of California wildflowers in the decor. So this is an image of California poppies. It's a different technique I developed to photograph flowers. It's called the contact series. With the contact series, it allows me to get the flower. I've developed a technique where I can get the flower petals gently in contact with the front of the lens that has a filter over it. And we'll talk more about that in the behind the scenes section.
And here's another example of both contact and how the images were used. And wildflowers in California, you can see them in the Bay Area 12 months of the year. There generally aren't as many, but we just went out to Point Lobos and found 12 different wildflowers were blooming because they had some early rains. So we like to go out, since there aren't that many flowers, to the reserves in California to photograph the birds. And this is Merced National Wildlife Refuge. And we just love not only the visuals, but the sounds.
Merced National Wildlife Refuge is what, probably?
Central Valley.
Yeah, in the Central Valley, south of Sacramento, probably about an hour and a half's drive from the Bay Area.
This is near Sacramento, preserve in that area. Avocets were Highway 37, which is in the San Francisco Bay Area, and they just rehabbed a whole bunch of land for the birds. And even went out to New Mexico, to Bosque del Apache, to photograph the sandhill cranes.
This was taken in Golden Gate Park in San Francisco. This great blue heron was accustomed to people being there. I was probably about, maybe 10 or 15 feet from the bird, and the bird just stood there and allowed me to walk around to get the best framing of the bird's head between these branches in the distance. So there's a lot of wildlife in Golden Gate Park.
And sometimes when we're out photographing flowers, we get visited by birds. And in this case, it was a young red-tailed hawk. We were on a bluff above San Gregorio Beach, and this hawk was just right above my head checking out what we were doing.
So one of the most frequent questions we get asked is if we have a favorite wildflower bloom that we've seen over the 27 years we photographed before we created the book. And yeah, the answer is definitely yes. In 2003, there was a really exceptional bloom. There's Interstate 5 goes north from Los Angeles up and over the Tehachapi Mountains and down into the Great Central Valley. This area is about 4,000 feet, and the freeway goes through below. So from the bottom of the freeway to the top of the ridge was about 1,000 feet. And then this bloom with all these really intense, differently colored flowers extended for 1.5 miles in each direction. And so this was the most incredible bloom we've seen. Again, it was taken in 2003.
And this is the detail of that area. So it was just 100% flowers. And we were lucky that there was public land on the west side of the freeway. We drove up to the Hungry Valley State Vehicular area, and which is in the foreground, and we're able to look across the freeway, which is out of the picture at the bottom, to what Rob was just describing, and is currently private land, but we're hoping someday will be protected.
And what made this a really interesting and challenging time to photograph was the fact that the light was changing. We had arrived there at the tail end of a late spring storm in April, and as the storm was clearing, you could see these wonderful intense shafts of light moving across the landscape with the deep gray clouds in the background. So one of the hardest things to do was to settle on a composition, because wherever we looked, there were beautiful flowers and the light was changing.
Our second favorite place is an area you may have heard of, is Carrizo Plain National Monument in 2017. And we drove down towards Bakersfield and then went west over the Tembler Mountains. So if you saw photographs from that year, most of them were of the Tembler Mountains with the patches of yellow and purple and orange. And what was interesting about this photograph is it's showing you the difference between north-facing slopes and south-facing slopes. And you clearly have more flowers on the north facing slope that doesn't get as hot. And then we went across the plains to the western mountains, which are called the Caliente Mountains. And the mountains run east and west, north and south, as does the plain. And we had been told that the desert candles were blooming up there. And over our 27-year journey, we had not seen the desert candles. And here we were standing in front of tens of thousands of them. It was just a magical experience.
And another frequent question we get asked is if we have a favorite flower or favorite flowers, because we've photographed hundreds of them. And this is one of my favorite, if not the very, very favorite. What makes this such an unusual and beautiful flower to me is the fact that the stalk of this plant is hollow, and when the light comes through behind it, it just seems to glow this beautiful yellow color. At the top is this really intense magenta collection of buds, and as the flowers open, you can see down that stem, the flowers are very, very white, and then you have these beautiful lance-shaped green leaves at the bottom. So it's probably the most unusual flower we've seen. And it's just, again, a really hypnotic experience when there's a breeze and you see all these desert candles moving and glowing from the foreground to way into the distance. So this was the second most beautiful bloom we've seen in the 27 years we were photographing.
And what's interesting about this flower is it's actually in the mustard family. And this was the view looking east as we were coming down off the Caliente Mountains, across the plain, and towards Bakersfield and the Tembler Mountains. Oops, sorry. And this is a detail of some of the flowers down in the plains. And this was taken with my iPhone 6. And we figured out over the 27 years, we've used 12 different cameras, starting with film cameras and eventually going into digital cameras with sensors as large as 42 megapixels. And we work with Sony cameras and Canon lenses now.
So as I mentioned earlier, we'd like to take people behind the scenes and show them exactly how we get the photographs that we've gotten. So on the left side, on the left page, this is a spread that's in the book. At the top is an example of what we call a botanical portrait. So we use black or white backgrounds, either fabric or white or black plastic, to isolate the flower from its setting, because often there's a very distracting background with rocks or twigs. And the intent is to show the flower in its most beautiful light and give people a sense of as much detail as we can with this particular type of photography. So as I said, we use black fabrics or white fabrics behind the flowers. And after doing that for a while, it just kind of got boring to doing the same old thing. And I thought, well, what if I can use the folds in the fabrics to enhance the composition and complement the geometry of the flowers. So I developed this way of photographing flowers in a really, really detailed format, and it's called the Wrap series. And then on the bottom image, the pink checker bloom is part of my contact series that I mentioned earlier. I discovered a way that I could get the flower petals gently in contact with a filter over the front of the lens.
And so, can I just say, you want to use the filter because you don't want all the pollen and anything sticky actually on the lens itself.
Yeah, so it's a very, very clear filter. So because the lens in the camera was blocking the light that would normally fall on the flower and be reflected off the flower, the source of light that was available was light reflecting off of whatever was in the background. So instead of reflected light, the image is made with a transmitted light that's coming through the flower petals. So it gives it a really nice, soft and more abstract feeling. And I always make sure there's quite a bit in focus in the image, so people still have a sense of the detail of the flowers or the entire plant that I'm photographing. So this is my contact series.
And to give you a little more information, if you want to try it, is that working with a wide angle lens, usually a 16 millimeter,
Yeah.
right? And you have a, Rob works with a extension tube on the back so that you can focus really close. This image took us 2.5 hours to do.
Yeah. Another frequent question we get asked is, well, how long does it take you to photograph these flowers? We see what your setup looks like and things like that. How much time does it take? Well, we figured when we converted to digital photography, that made things so much easier because we could see what we were getting right away. We figured that it takes us about an hour to do a flower. But when we were doing film, this image is what took us the longest. Nita found this flower in the late evening after the sun had set, was because we were using film, there wasn't enough light to photograph the flower. So we came back early the next morning when the sunlight was really low and really directional coming from the left. You can see me there. I'm looking at a Polaroid of the portrait of the flower. I had a back on my medium format camera that was a Polaroid back, so I could see what I was getting. We figured that we had to bounce light in from the opposite side of the flower that was being lit by the sun. After a few Polaroids, we figured, well, we had to bounce light into the front. And after another Polaroid, we saw that we had highlights underneath the flower, so we had to put our jackets to create the shade beneath the flower. So this image took us an hour, 2.5 hours.
And this was the final product.
And what made this really interesting this year was normally this flower has a stalk that's about 2.5 feet tall with flowers alternating going up the stem. Well, this year was an El Nino rain event year, meant that the desert got a lot of rain. So the plant was putting out 3 stalks and just an incredible amount of buds. And you can see that this flower is nowhere near the 2.5 feet that it usually is.
So we live 5 miles north of the Golden Gate Bridge in Marin County, which is 40% public land. And that makes it really special as far as the land and species that are available to us. Plus it goes from the ocean to over 2,000 feet on Mount Tamalpais. So it's a number of the images in our book are from Marin County. And I was really fortunate. Not only would Rob carry 65 pounds of equipment, he was very willing to get into really uncomfortable positions to take the photograph. It was a joint effort. It was really hard for either of us to do a photograph by ourselves. So in the book, the images are his, hers, and ours, but mostly ours as a joint effort. And these are really wonderful calypso orchids that grow in pine forests. So there's no other color around except these. And you don't have to have fancy equipment to make this work. You can use all kinds of things to block the wind or reflect light. And do you want to say anything else about this one? Or
no, well, we were fortunate because there was the end of a spring storm and there were these gray clouds in the sky that created a really, really soft enveloping light. Photographing this flower in sunlight would have looked completely different and not had the softness that I wanted to show that this checker bloom exists when you find it out in nature.
And then if you don't have the light you want, we will use diffusion discs in order to soften the light. And we'll show that a little later.
Most often we'll photograph the flower with a black background and a white background, and then take the images at home and decide which version we like, and sometimes we like both of them.
We're also very careful to not damage the environment that these flowers are found in. So we photograph next to trails and roads. And if we can't access a flower without doing damage, we will wait and find another one. And we also will photograph from different angles, not always straight on. So it's can give you interesting perspectives.
This is a beautiful example of a
Franciscan paintbrush.
thank you, of a Franciscan paintbrush. We had been looking for a really nice symmetrical version. We found this in Rodeo Beach, Golden Gate National Recreation Area. This was probably just about 2 or 3 miles from the Golden Gate Bridge. We were using this tent to block the wind. It's a really windy area. After photographing the flower in its entirety, I looked really closely at the top of the blossom and saw that it looked like there were these really intense scarlet flames coming out of the top. So sometimes we don't photograph the entire flower and just look for a nice abstract impression of the flower. We always find something in focus to give people a sense of the detail, even if it's an abstract.
And we also love some of these flowers for their fragrance. The Western azalea is particularly fragrant. So if you ever get a chance to be near one, please check out the fragrance. It's just beautiful.
This is Nita's image of which iris?
This is the Shasta iris.
Oh, the Shasta iris. This is all on public land. You could see this area had been logged and it's starting to recover. This is a 2-page spread in the book.
And we drove 150 miles to Northern California to get the mountain lady slipper, which I'll show you later, and then found this as well. And I mentioned about softening the light. If you can't, if you want to photograph during the day, when the light might be really harsh, we use diffusion discs to soften the light. And then we can also decide how close to have it to the plant, how far, what the angle is. And in this case, we decided to put it behind the flower so that it had the sense of being lit from inside. And then we use reflectors under the camera in order to fill in the shadow that was created by having the diffusion disc in the back.
This is, as you can see, as it's identified, it's a sacred datura, and it's called sacred because this plant has been used in Native American rituals. Every part of the plant is toxic. If you eat too much, it's poisonous, but it has hallucinogenic properties. So the Native Americans use this in their religious rituals.
And people often ask us what we're doing next. We are trying to raise funds now to create an audio described book for the visually impaired. So imagine you can't see these images. And this is an image that we describe as a sampler. You can find it on our website. And we not only describe what it physically looks like, but we include what was the experience, the environment it was in, how we photographed it. And then we'll also be using nature sounds by Bernie Krause, who's a world-renowned sound ecologist, to represent the ecosystem that this flower was found in. And I'll tell you a little later about how you could help us with this project, or if you know anyone who can. Here's another example of the wrap series. And this was with a white fabric on a place called Ring Mountain Preserve in Marin County, And that's Mount Tamalpais in the background. And this was area, one of the reasons this area was preserved, it's one of our favorite wildflower areas in Marin County, was because of this flower, which is the Tiburon mariposa lily that only grows on Ring Mountain in a few populations and nowhere else in the world.
As you can see, we've hiked up into some high desert passes. This is about 11,000 feet in the Eastern Sierra. You can see that the background was nothing but rocks and a few plants. So I decided, well, I can wrap these beautiful pygmy daisies and come up with a very nice composition. So often it takes more time to come up with a composition for the folds than it does to select the composition for just the flowers themselves. And the slightest wind can blow the folds away, so it can be very, very frustrating. But if I get something right, it's really rewarding.
And chiffon is a fabric we found that worked really well, had nice folds in it.
This is a beautiful alpine columbine that we photographed on the way back from our hike to Morgan Pass. As we mentioned before, we photograph flowers under different lighting conditions. Sometimes we see a flower in bright sunlight and we look closely and see, well, there might be some beautiful details that can be highlighted by sunlight that you might not see if we used a light diffuser. So we'll go and photograph the flower with sunlight and then use a diffuser and photograph it under diffuse light. And you can see the same flower feels very, very different under different lighting conditions. So that's one reason why it takes us about an average of an hour to do a flower, because there's so many different ways to photograph it. Another really frequent question we get asked is, well, how much Photoshop work do you do? Well, we photograph in the raw file format. So everything has to be processed through some image processing software, and what we use is Photoshop. So this image was taken under blue skylight, which created a blue cast falling on the scene. The camera sensor records the exact color of light in the scene, and because our eyes adjust for the light that we're seeing, we didn't see the scene look blue, but that's the color that the camera recorded. So we needed to go back in Photoshop and adjust the color balance so we could see what it was we saw. Also, the camera sensor is designed to create as much detail in the highlights and shadows as possible, so that creates a very low contrast image. Camera sensor is also designed to create as many different subtle colors, so it often gives a very flat image. So we have to take the image back in Photoshop, and this was what we actually saw. So we had to color correct. We needed to warm it up so that the white flower petals were actually white and not tinged with blue from the blue skylight. So that's the kind of work we do in Photoshop.
We also always put the background in, whether it's white or black, but at times the background needs to be cleaned up a bit so it's a pure white. In this case, the leopard lilies. We also deal with windy conditions and in this case, very sandy conditions. The plant's very low to the ground. So we have two pieces of black fabric, and which you can see, and also the plant is very low contrast, low saturation, and then you'll have all the sand. We take it into Photoshop and clean it up.
And that was what we saw. So our intent is always to show the flower exactly as anyone would see it, the right colors, the right saturation, and the right contrast.
And we are dealing with wind, we're dealing with rain, we're dealing with heat. and sometimes even cold. And in this case, we were in Utah, and we were dealing with no-see-ums. And probably a lot of you have had experience with no-see-ums and know how nasty they are. I remember them from the East Coast, especially up in Maine. And they get into everything. They're worse than mosquitoes because they will crawl up your nose and in your ears and in your clothes. So I was forced, we were in the middle of nowhere, driving to Taos, New Mexico, and we had seen these flowers, and within 3 minutes they had found us, and we were like going, how did they find us? And Rob did some research and realized that they eat nectar, but they need blood in order to reproduce. So I was forced to go back to the car, get a couple of pairs of my clean underwear to try to keep them out of our ears. And this is the only time I've seen Rob wearing women's underwear. And this was the result of lying on the ground photographing in Capitol Reef National Monument. And we figured Rob must have had about 200 different bites. And they itch worse than mosquitoes.
And they last
longer.
a long time.
So we had been photographing throughout the West. Rob had created a project called Beauty and the Beast, Wildflowers and Climate Change. And the curator of the San Francisco Main Library's Jewett Gallery asked us to create one that focused on California. So in 2016, we created this exhibit with 100 images and text panels that would educate people about wildflowers, climate change, and conservation. We also had a number of the guidebooks to identify flowers, and these wonderful, we also showed that binoculars are an important tool when you're looking for wildflowers. And we found out about these wonderful knee pads made by Ergodyne. They're for the professional trade, but they're wonderful if you're kneeling either in the garden or when you're photographing, and they feel like kneeling in thick jello. So we created a traveling exhibit from the one at the library. So 52 of the images have been traveling throughout the state. And then we were fortunate to have the San Diego Natural History Museum contact us about creating a custom large print version of the exhibit. So some of the images were up to 12 feet tall. Unfortunately, due to COVID, we never got to have an opening or closing, which was very sad for us. But to expand on the panels, we decided to do a companion coffee table book. And as I mentioned, we wanted diversity, diverse group of voices. So we asked a number of authors to write, whether they were nature writers, environmental leaders, or scientists. And out of the 16 authors in the book, 11 are women, and ranging in age from 20 to 82.
We have 18 short stories in the first person. They average about 1,200 words, about 5 minutes to read. We paste the images in the book and the essays sequentially, so that people would continue turning, see more flowers, and read more short stories. The book has 3 different sections.
The gift of beauty.
The gift of beauty, the human connection, and ensuring the future.
And the purpose of our exhibit and our book is to inspire hope and action. And so instead of inspiring people and just leaving them trying to figure out what to do, we actually include 25 different things you can do to make a difference. And here's a quick sampling of some of the essays. Gordon Lepig is a scientist with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, and he writes about wildflowers and climate change. Yesterday, I actually ran into someone who said that there is a Carnegie Museum just put out a report on how wildflowers are affecting, how climate change is affecting wildflowers in North America.
The East Coast.
And their focus area of research was in Pennsylvania.
Another really fascinating essay talks about phenology, which is the timing of natural events, and how climate change is disrupting this. For example, the rufous hummingbird needs to have flowers blooming along its migration from Mexico into Canada up to its breeding grounds. If there's too little snow and it's warmer than normal, the flowers bloom earlier before the bird gets there, so the bird doesn't have that nectar source to feed itself along its migration. If the flowers bloom too early and a frost hits, then the blossoms can be destroyed by the frost, and again the flowers aren't there for the birds. So it's a really fascinating article about Ryan Burnett's research with a rufous-sided hummingbird and the wildflower metals it needs along its migration.
And if you have, as I mentioned earlier, this is Carson Pass, that same area where we had our backpacks. If there's too much snow and the flowers are 3 to 4 weeks late, that's also a problem for the hummingbirds, and they are definitely showing a decrease in numbers of the hummingbirds.
This is probably the luckiest image that we have photographed in the 30 years we've been photographing. Nita was holding the background really still. Just the slightest breeze can move these flowers. So I was just waiting for the breeze to stop. Occasionally when it looked like it would stop, I'd look through the viewfinder to take the picture. Well, I was lucky enough to be looking through the viewfinder when this rufous-sided hummingbird
Rufous
came.
hummingbird.
Oh,
That's you're thinking of the towhee.
Yeah, thank you for correcting me. That's funny.
These are birders. You got to get it right.
Yeah, I got to get it right. So I was looking through the viewfinder and I got 2 frames of the bird left. We waited a little while longer. Nita standing perfectly still. The bird never came back. The image on the right was the raw file that we captured, and
Before processing,
and this was what we got once we processed it to what it was we actually saw.
We also include information about importance of pollinators, again, which is really important for the birds to be able to have these insects as a food source as well. Susan Dwight wrote a story about the 5 deserts of California. Robin Wall Kimmerer, you may know her work from Braiding Sweetgrass, Native American botany professor, wrote a really interesting story about the naming of plants. Wendy Takuda, a retired news anchor, got involved in doing restoration work. And out here in California, broom is a really nasty invasive. And her article's very funny article about Zen and the art of pulling broom. Talking to children about climate change without scaring them. And seed saving. Genevieve Arnold is with the Theater Pain Foundation, and they have an extensive seed bank that they're collecting.
We also have a section in the book about fire ecology, what flowers come back after an area has burned. And I'm sure you're aware that California has been burning a lot in the past 20 years. So it's given us opportunity to photograph flowers after a fire has gone through. This is a beautiful fire poppy that we photographed Cleveland National Forest, which is probably an hour and a half, 2 hours drive south of Los Angeles.
And the fire poppy is also known as a fire follower, that they show up mainly when there's been a fire. And wildflowers can, if it's not too hot a fire, can actually do quite well. This is only 6 months after a really devastating fire had gone through this area.
This whole area was completely burned.
And the bulbs in particular do well. They ash becomes a fertilizer, and because the overstory has been burned away, they get a lot more sunlight. We found that some seeds actually want the chemical that comes with the ash from flowers to germinate.
And the smoke. Yeah.
and the smoke.
This area had been completely burned,
So no thatch is left. It's really clean.
and just about a mile down the road, the same area had been completely burned. This area had also been burned. You can see the pine trees in the upper left had been burned. This is what came back afterward.
These are a couple of flowers that we also found in the burn areas. And these two flowers were together as they were. We did not put them together. We like the contrast of the purple and orange. And we're going to take you through some of our favorite areas in the deserts. This is Death Valley during a super bloom. So at the bottom, you can see the whole valley was just covered with the desert sunflowers.
Sometimes it's not about these massive blooms. Sometimes it's about how individual flower species thrive in a really inhospitable area.
And sometimes you don't think there's anything blooming, but if you look a little closer, you can find, for example, the broom rape, desert broom rape in among the rocks. Or the rambling milkweed and the crab spider. This was our first experience at a super bloom. They were called 100-year blooms back then because they only happened, the conditions came together every 100 years, but because
Okay, goodbye.
it is now because of the deluge and then the dry periods, it happens much more often. So they now call it a super bloom.
This was done in 1998, as was this image.
In Joshua Tree National Park.
Sometimes the ground details are very, very interesting. Joshua Tree is primarily granite. The granite erodes into a really coarse granitic soil, and it's just fascinating to see flowers growing out of what seems like nothing could grow. This is a desert wash in the southern part of Joshua Tree. On an average year, this is a desert canterbury bell. There's a flower scattered here and there up and down the wash. In 1998, there was an amazing amount of record-breaking rain, and these are the flowers that came out of the seed bank that was in this coarse granitic soil.
And not only was it, it kept raining, so not only was there large numbers of plants, but the plants kept getting larger and larger and putting out more and more flowers. These are a couple other examples of what we photographed in Joshua Tree.
And these are all images that are in the book.
And we just love the diversity of flowers, colors, shapes, sizes.
This is chia, which is grown commercially, and it's a really nutritive seed. And birds love them.
You may have heard about the super blooms in Anza Borrego Desert State Park, where when we used to go, there would be a few thousand people in the park. Now there are tens of thousands of people who try to get in on the same weekend and can create quite the traffic jams. But every desert is different, has different geography, different plants. Oops. And again, we try to photograph from different angles.
So this is where it all started in 1992. This image was probably taken about 10 years later in the Antelope Valley, California Poppy Reserve.
And this was taken the same trip as the Gorman trip, which was had the storm clouds as well. And here you can see that there are just poppies. There's no gilia, and they're all closed because poppies tend to close when it's windy or when it's overcast or raining. So again, I mentioned that we created this project to try to encourage people to take action, such as voting or planting local native plants to help the wildlife, join organizations, donate, and volunteer.
And we'll have more images of the book later.
Coming up shortly. We're almost through. And we also encourage people to become citizen scientists. I'm sure many of you in Audubon are familiar with this. Scientists all over the world use the information that gets entered. And we're going to take you quickly through our garden. This is actually the cedar waxwings that come through in the wintertime. This was taken from our bedroom window. And this is cotoneaster, which is a nasty invasive in California. It feeds birds, but it overtakes other plants. And so what we encourage people to do is to plant the native version, which is the toyon. And we get tons of birds, bluebirds and crows and jays, thrushes, etc., eating from the toyon. And there are a number of different places where you can identify plants. These tend to be more California focused. And I can send Linda, if she needs it again, an email that has all the different links that we talk about.
These are some images from our native plant garden.
Narrowleaf milkweed for the monarch butterfly. And this is just 13 days later. It's just much bigger. They're just constantly eating for days. And then they create the chrysalis. And this is the milkweed flower. And we were really fortunate to have this giant, the biggest dragonfly I'd ever seen, hanging out on the milkweed. These are the seeds from the milkweed and a few different plants that are also found in our garden. Ceanothus is a particularly good one. It has a wonderful fragrance, and the pollinators, it's covered with bees and flies. And this is what they look like really close up, tiny little itty bitty flowers in each cluster. And some of them are late bloomers, such as the California fuchsia that blooms in the fall. So plantid.net, again, is a place for identifying flowers. It's especially good for beginners. CalFlora is more advanced. And these are some of the sources for wildflower reports in California area.
Some of the images in the book, I mean, some of the flowers in the book were taken out of state, and we wanted to include them because those species are still found in California. We hadn't found these species while we were photographing, so we wanted to put them in the book to show more of the diversity. We also like looking for flowers when there's an interesting background. This is serpentine rock. It's the state rock. We found this in the Sierra foothills. That's exactly how we found the plant and the rock.
Another favorite area is Table Mountain near Chico, northeast of San Francisco. And I mentioned earlier the lady slipper, the mountain lady slipper that we drove all the way to Northern California for, and that's the one on the left. Very different from the one in the East Coast. And just a couple more pages that are found in the book. I just love the diversity that's found in flowers. These are some of the native orchids. So in the exhibit and in the book, we include 14 different ecological regions of California, the map and description of it. California is considered a bio hotspot by the UN. And go ahead.
The book has a glossary to define different terms that are included in all the different essays, all the different short stories. It has a plant name index and a location index. So if people want to know, well, what's blooming in Death Valley, what's blooming in Joshua Tree, people can go to the location.
Anybody puzzling?
I'm sorry, what? What was the question? Okay.
I don't think it was directed at us. So the book is available in two forms. There's the regular edition book and a deluxe signed limited edition book with a special cover, a signed and numbered tip-in page, and a clamshell box you can keep it in. And if you ever have access to the regular edition book, we encourage you to peel back the paper dust jacket, and this is the cover that's underneath the paper one. As I mentioned, we're working on raising funds in order to create an visually a version of our book that's accessible to the visually impaired and also those with reading barriers. And we are a sponsored project of Marin Link. So marinlink.org/donations is where you could make tax deductible donations. And we look forward to hearing from people through our website, or I put in our contact information into the chat. So we want to thank everyone for joining us all the way from Long Island. Hope you didn't have too much traffic getting here.
And as Nita mentioned, you can learn more at wildflowerbooks.com. And we like to close with a quote from David Brower. Truth and beauty can still win battles. We need more art, more passion, and more wit in defense of the earth. Thank you for everyone that watched our presentation, and we look forward to any questions that you may have.